Uh, so I was just trying to recall our last conversation that we had that we could not properly record, and I remember you mentioning this interesting idea of uh, organization also in itself developing a kind of ego, uh, and then you have individual ego, organization ego. Um uh, do you would you would you say that the bureaucracy that gets seeped in, the standard operating procedures that seep in, the rules and norms and incentives that get coded in the organization, do they also form the organization ego, or are you referring to something else?
Look, I think, the concept of organization ego is very abstract, but as you grow and develop and you get, you graduate to incumbent status in our language, we find that, all of those things, how you manage and measure risk, bureaucracy, functionalization, internal focus, et cetera, all kind of add up to almost a proxy for organizational ego, where the organization is the center. In other words, they're looking inside out as opposed to, the world, the market, and the customer is the center, which is, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's a useful one to be able to think that, the organizations that can transcend that, just like individuals can transcend their own ego, and look outside rather than inside, tend to, of course, find more opportunities, get closer to customers, become more essential to customers, and tend to be more competitive in the long run. So I guess that's kind of the way we think about it.
Interesting. Um, and would this also mean that because such is the case, it also uh, doesn't lend itself for rapid innovation? Uh, uh, would you agree with that, or is there something that you want to add to that?
Well, innovation's tricky because typically those types of organizations can innovate, but the types of innovation that they focus on or the types of problem sets they focus on tend to be very much about the firm. So they tend to be great at process innovation because internally focused firms tend to eventually focus more on the EBIT line than anything else. And consequently, they can be quite good at innovating organization and process to generate more cash and to improve the EBIT line. We saw that, kind of at the peak of General Electric, for example, when Jack Welch was there were hundreds of Six Sigma engineers running around that place, trying to improve everything. But, they drifted further and further apart from the market as compared to their peers. So that was, kind of an interesting era for them. They also tend to be very good at what Christensen called sustaining innovation, which is, code for product or service innovation that's, essentially building on an existing core product or line extensions of those products. So they tend to be good at that kind of stuff, largely because especially sustaining innovation requires a lot of resources and scale, and the resources available to large and complex incumbents tend to be quite significant. So they're able to use those resources. What they're not good at, though, is innovation in terms of how they engage with customers or think differently about how to express value to consumers. They're good at thinking about what causes pain for consumers and how to resolve that, but not really good at innovating opportunities to find new sources of value with customers. So that's a gap. And, more nimble challenger type firms are way better at that. And then the other gap is, they're really good, those big incumbent firms, or they don't have to be big, but incumbent firms tend to be really good at extracting more value out of their existing business model, or extrapolating or extracting more value out of existing capabilities than developing or innovating new business models or developing or innovating new capabilities. And then finally, they're not great at operating models either. So what typically has to happen is major transformation to unstitch pretty hardwired operating models when there's any kind of disruption whatsoever. So, they're not inherently flexible and adaptive to that kind of change, anti-agile in the modern lingo, I suppose. So therefore, it takes a long time to mobilize resources and there's a lot of political challenges to making those types of changes. So those operating models last a relatively long time when things are stable. When things are unstable, they can come apart pretty quickly and create really significant inefficiency.
It's interesting. I was having this conversation with a wonderful person here in India called Shutapa Banerjee. She's on the boards of some of the leading companies in India like Godrej and Manapuram, and these are big names. These are big brand names in India. And she was mentioning an interesting thing. She herself had a career where she rose to the ranks of the CEO at a very young age and was in the finance industry in the portfolio management space. And then people would walk up to her and they would really laud that she's become so successful. And she would turn around and just say that, maybe she was in an era where the industry life cycles were slightly longer. A lot of low-hanging fruits could be taken. But now it's a different era where, the consolidation cycles, the disruption cycles, the industry consolidations, they're all shrinking or maybe even, being reimagined. Would you agree with that, or anything you want to add?
I think as a general rule, I'd absolutely agree with it. Obviously, by industry, those cycles are, subtly or importantly different. But yeah, definitely, the compression of those cycles is underway, and it has been for years and years. And I think a lot of the things that general managers and CEOs that are kind of leading organizations now were taught techniques that were appropriate for an era of relative long stability, and with a relative long runway to be able to handle those changes. And I think increasingly that's harder and harder, to use your example, for modern leaders to cope with that. And they just require new models and new ways to think about these problems. And there are certainly some that do really well, and others that are challenged. One company I've been watching for, I think, 7 years now, maybe 6 years, is it's been interesting to contrast the Ford Motor Company in their journey to cope with the disruptive threat of Tesla. And over that 6 years, they've basically gone through 3 big phases, and it's been fascinating to watch. Phase 1 was the incumbent CEO, Mark Fields, who was, really a marketing guy coming out of the end of the internal combustion era, and looking at, EV and kind of future transportation with a speculative long distance eye, but with the idea that, hey guys, hang on a minute, we got to really stay focused on, the core engine of value, which is internal combustion, growth in China and India, and, and emissions, with a relatively low indexing of focus on EV. But when Mark Fields was sacked, which I think was roughly May of 2017, you can sort of almost imagine what the board conversation was looking like there, where that was the month where Tesla became more valuable than Ford. And, so he was sacked, and they brought in an industry outsider, a guy by the name of Jim Hackett, who was an old industrial turnaround guy who had turned around Steelcase, which was an American furniture manufacturer. And, he came on board, and he lasted about 2 years, and the DNA of Ford kind of pushed back because he wasn't a car guy. His version of turnaround wasn't really fast enough in this era of kind of hyper-dynamic market change, where, now during his tenure, Tesla's market value is sort of doubling every 6 months. You know what I mean? And Ford is pretty stagnant, still roughly around the same market valuation during, as it was during the Mark Fields years. So finally they got it, sort of phase 3. They brought in the new guy, whose name escapes me just now. I'll think of it in a second. He's kind of a digital transformation guy, but with a deep history in automotive, so a little bit of best of both worlds. And now, even though that's been too slow, I think Ford is now all in. And, over the period of, Jim Farley's the guy's name, over the period of Jim Farley's tenure, which is only about 3 years now, they've gone from a distant back of the pack on EV to now one of, I think they're number 2 in North America. And they're at a rate of knots with the Mustang Mach-E product and now the F-150 electric product, which is, selling faster than they can make it. And, they've also made huge investments in storage technology and, that transformation's unfolding at a rate of knots. But the big insight for those guys was, finally that the Tesla business model is different, and the way it's set up is, the fundamental difference is the economics aren't the same. How the customer experiences the value aren't the same. Supply side in terms of supply side in terms of manufacturing isn't the same, and distribution, dealer networks, and all that stuff isn't the same. So that's been a fascinating case to watch because, even though it's 6 years, if you think about it, 6 years is only a little bit more than a traditional internal combustion automotive development cycle, right? So from design to market. So maybe that's 4 years, 4.5 years. So that doesn't seem like all that long of a period of time to make that big of an adjustment for a company like Ford. And it's been fascinating to watch. So it can be done. I think that's the thing. That's why I think it's exciting to see what's happening with these case studies.
Some fascinating things emerging, Matt, and wonderful that you shared this case. It brings back to an interesting question about if you were to just, for the sake of argument, say a one-person centric change model. Get a good person at the top, and then you can start a cascade of change in the organization. This case study talks that could be one of the big factors for it.
I don't know if it's a one-person thing. I don't really buy into that idea of a hero leader.
I was going to actually question you on that. Please go ahead.
I don't buy into that. I think it's a combination of things. So certainly the leader plays a key role because, it's necessary but not sufficient in a sense. You know what I mean? Like the board, the management team, the consumer, everybody else has to be ready for the change too. And you can have a leader, pushing the rock up the hill, but that rock keeps rolling back down to the bottom in spite of their best efforts. So the timing of all these kind of, let's call them concurrent trends has to mesh together at the right time to drive the change. Ultimately, there's and I can't remember the guy's name, so I'm going to steal this, but recognize that it's not mine, and but acknowledge that I don't remember where it came from.
I'll plug it in. I'll plug it in the video edits. Please go ahead.
That's fine. But the idea of the change equation is first a function of dissatisfaction, right? So how dissatisfied is the system, not just the individual, with the status quo? And is that dissatisfaction big enough to overcome the resistance to changing, right? The second factor is the vision for that change clear, and does everyone understand it, and can they connect to it? If that vision's not clear, in other words, we don't know where we're going, we might be dissatisfied with it, but all things equal, we'll stick with what we know rather than change. So we also need to know where we're heading and see that that's actually achievable, which then comes to implementation. if people have confidence that it can be accomplished, and those three things come together to overcome the resistance. So it's basically you're multiplying, your dissatisfaction times the vision times your confidence in implementation. And if those three things come together and overcome the amount of resistance, then fundamentally you get the shift.
So there is a move on evidence-based management practices where some of the people are coming out and trying to do it more research-oriented. And they're not saying it wasn't happening earlier, but maybe what they're saying is more rigor is required. How would you respond to something like this, Matt?
That's nothing new, right? That's, Frederick Taylor and, literally a century ago. So from that point of view, look, I think ultimately the evidence is, does it work or doesn't it work, right? The problem is that with any given organizational entity, a firm, if you will, you can't do them both at the same time and do the A/B test to see if one worked and one didn't. You have to try one and then fail, or try one and then succeed, so you can do that in a linear fashion, but it's harder to do it in parallel. Although obviously you could do something in one business unit and something else in another business unit, but their environmental context is quite different. So what ends up happening is heuristics get developed, which are, based on evidence. Lots of people tried it and it worked, or lots of people tried it and it didn't work. And then what falls out of those heuristics are certain principles, right? So I'll give you 4 or 5 examples right now, which are ones that you could debate one way or the other, are evidence-based or not. But, anecdotally, having worked in this area for a long time, I could say that I believe them, right? But again, those are heuristics for me. So, one is the idea that command and control and vertical structures are inherently efficient for fixed business models and stable environments, but work very poorly in highly disruptive environments where market conditions, in particular customer behavior, is changing rapidly. So a more horizontal approach is required from an operating model point of view to be successful in that type of environment. Okay. Therein lies a trade-off between what we would describe as customer proximity and internal functional efficiency, because you're giving up a unit of one to achieve a unit of the other. That said, I would rather have a unit that generates more sales than a unit that generates a one additional unit or basis point of profitability, especially in volatile and growth markets, right? So that's, ideally you get them both, but that's one. So I think that to me, that's probably a really important one. 2 is decentralized decision-making. Is that better or not, right? Certainly people that are empowered to make decisions when they're sitting in front of a customer have a greater opportunity to delight that customer than people that have to go through a bureaucratic process to be able to answer a question or deal with an issue for a customer. So, again, decentralized decision-making makes sense, I think, where people are interacting with the customer and the market, and maybe not so much where you need a highly functional and highly repeatable sort of process. You know what I mean? Sort of turning the bolt or whatever. It has to be, or in a pharmaceutical setting, you can't just change the research protocol in a clinical trial. Those things have to be managed carefully and centrally to allow that to take place. But you can decentralize how a doctor speaks with a patient, for example. So being really smart about that's another one. And I think that a big one, and we talked about ego the last time. I think a big one is to what degree does the organization exist only at the boundaries of the firm? In other words, we're the firm, we've got a brand and that's our kind of territory, versus, you know, the more extended enterprise where, you know, customers and partners and suppliers and so forth are viewed as part of a, you know, kind of a meta enterprise. And I think that's changing too. I think more and more, you know, now the word ecosystem is kind of in the general jargon, and we realize that almost no firm can compete successfully by themselves without the right combination of external capabilities. But I don't think management is caught up with that. I mean, typically, who does this, you know, who does the strategic planning? The same 8 old guys sitting around the table, gals too, but very seldomly do you see a customer or supplier sitting around that table providing input into those discussions, for example. So there's lots of change. There's lots of opportunity to create that change before we even get into leadership and, you know, what that means and how that's changing.
Right. Tying it back to the example that you shared, Matt, about Ford as a company, I'm also reminded that here in India, one of the oldest business group and a very respected business group, Tata's, some years back, just a few years back, brought at the helm of the entire Tata group a person who was at the helm of the Tata Consultancy Services, which was the technology giant that Tata has.
Yeah.
And again, I think it was a move to get somebody who understands digital or technology at the helm of the overall conglomerate to be able to see if there could be transformation brought in rather than somebody from a brick and mortar background. So just that as an example clicked.
Sure.
With technology playing such a huge and such a significant role in disrupting business models and industries, and if whatever limited that I understand of technology, they're constantly building themselves, their capabilities or their products around a very around the ethos of constant adaptation. So there's no final destination as such. And that, if I put that and I say that this is now seeping into almost all the industries because all industries are thinking digital now. What changes do you think this would have in the whole overall, you know, one is leadership capability and the whole idea of strategy planning and execution. Do you think about these things?
Every day, every minute, right? That's, you know, there's no arguing, I think, at this point that, you know, digital and the resulting disruption and therefore transformation that's required for every firm and every industry, whether you're you know, government, listed, non-listed, small, large, doesn't matter. It's going to play a role there. And, you know, what does that mean? Well, there's an interesting kind of, you know, there's an interesting kind of discussion to be had. I think there's one school of thought that says it's all digital and digital, everything. And another school of thought that says that digital plays a key role, but there are other, you know, there are other shifts and trends that also play a role, and these all mesh together to create this change. I'm with the latter school of thought because you know, we have other things that are happening in the world that are, you know, that are not just digital. Climate change being a principal one, you know, political upheaval being another one. There's a lot of things that are happening that are, you know, that mesh together with digital to create that change. Now to your question, do these things drive the need for how we change our strategy, our innovation, our execution, our leadership? Totally, right? So, you know, we've already discussed it. The need to cycle much more quickly is a requirement because things are changing more quickly. You know, you can't be very slow in decision making, and you can't make decisions that you can expect that are going to be durable for a generation. You just can't do that. So that requires us to continuously challenge and test the assumptions upon which our business models, operating models, our go-to-market, everything are built. But you know what? Most firms don't do that. They develop a set of assumptions and they live with them for a long time, and they don't change them until those assumptions are proven to be untrue on the battlefield. Okay, in other words, there's some failure resulting from it doesn't work anymore, basically. So I think, for those kinds of management processes, they have to go faster. They have to learn to deploy resources more quickly. As I've already mentioned, they have to get closer to the market and to the customer. They have to be devolved to create more empowerment, and they have to work relentlessly at removing the constraints that are thrown in front of us mostly by our historical structures, capabilities, and, as you mentioned earlier, bureaucracy, right? So we create a lot of those constraints that we have to work hard to unpick to be able to create that agility, which is a big challenge. From a leadership point of view, how do you cope with all of that? I think the first thing is to recognize that we don't live in a stable world and ask the question, what does leading in an unstable world look like? You can't have all the answers. The best you can do is have the right questions. And, command and control, especially for large enterprises, is just too slow, right? So I think there's the inversion of what leadership has become, and this ties back to pre-ego and post-ego, where, senior leaders, sure, they still have to set direction and help the organization understand where we're heading, but the inversion is they have to become the chief bottleneck removers, you know what I mean? As opposed to the creators of those bottlenecks. And in many ways, leadership needs to learn to be able to operate in a way that helps, line employees and the extended enterprise to identify and capture these opportunities in a way that's not super reliant on them making any decisions other than setting direction and removing obstacles along the way. We don't have time now, but there's a really interesting case study which came out of China, which is the big white goods manufacturer Haier has experimented with a number of different operating models to fundamentally move from what started as a big functional behemoth to a very granular kind of market focused organization structure or operating model that's typified by hundreds of highly entrepreneurial market focused subunits that are designed to scan and identify opportunities and empowered to exploit those using the scale and the resources of the group. So that leadership has worked over about a decade to keep devolving more and more power down through the organization and out closer to the market, and in a sort of a zero distance to the customer kind of philosophy, which is tremendously interesting.
There's so much to cover there, Matt. Wonderful threads you sparked off. I'll just list them down so that we can take them up the next time.
Sure.
So one thing that came up for me was this puzzle of, as you said, the inversion of the leadership, where the leader has to also think in terms of chief bottleneck officer, removing the bottlenecks in the organization. And I think one big challenge that I see there is we as human beings aren't creating things with our hands anymore. So there isn't things that are tangible. All we keep trading throughout the day is opinions and judgments and conversations. And there is some kind of intangibility to it in some sense. Now, I'm reminded of Russell Aikoff in one of his talks was mentioning about the distinction that he draws between data, information, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. So I believe that whoever is at the helm, their ability to lead the team will also depend on distilling these different layers and trying to make actionable insights out of them. So that's one thing that we should speak about. And the second point that came to me was when you discussed about the Chinese example was I came across the work of Frederick Laloux. He's written a book called Reinventing Organization, where the whole paradigm is a decentralized decision-making and accountability system, where the teams interfacing the customer, the moment of truths, are at the helm of decision making in some sense. So these are a couple of things. So I think we'll close for now and then resume taking up some of these points in our next call, Matt.
That sounds great.